"Did you just tame our guardian? Human!" becomes a battle cry as Caleb and Tiara, their consciousness fully merged with Zarok's, confront the massive void rift. Instead of destroying the invaders, they release golden healing energy that transforms both the rift and void spawn. Their choice to understand, rather than annihilate, creates harmony between worlds, fulfilling the ancient prophecy in an unexpected way. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Casilla. The ancient city's blue-tinted walls shimmered in the early light, their protective embrace having sheltered generations of Casilians for millennia. High above the city center, the Dragon Temple's spires pierced the sky, their crystalline tips catching the sunlight and scattering it in prismatic patterns across the marketplace below. Caleb Grayson pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he wandered through the awakening marketplace. 6 days, stranded on this backwater planet, and he was no closer to finding the parts needed to repair his ship. The locals, blue-skinned humanoids with iridescent markings along their temples, regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Humans were rare in this sector, and Caleb knew his presence disrupted their carefully ordered society. "Fresh Ragnar fruit, picked at dawn from the Crimson Waste," a merchant called out, her 4-fingered hands arranging spiky purple orbs in an intricate display. Caleb approached, digging into his pocket for the few local coins he'd managed to barter for yesterday. "How much for 3? The merchant's silver eyes widened slightly before she composed herself. "For you, outsider, 12 shimmerstones." "That's double what you charged the last customer," Caleb said with a wry smile. 7. 10, and I include preservation wrapping." "Done." He dropped the coins into her palm, watching as she carefully wrapped the fruits in a shimmering membrane. A sudden hush fell over the marketplace. Caleb turned, following the collective gaze of the crowd toward the city's eastern gate. The massive stone doors, each etched with intricate dragon motifs, were swinging open. A procession of robed figures emerged from the shadows beyond, their blue faces painted with ceremonial white markings. At their center walked a young woman whose elaborate headdress marked her as someone of importance. "The Dragon Keeper's morning ritual," whispered a voice at Caleb's elbow. He glanced down to see a small Cassilian child, no more than 8 or 9 years old. "Tiara goes to feed Zarok before the sun reaches midpoint." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Zarok?" The child looked at him as though he'd asked what heir was. "The Guardian, of course. The great dragon who protects our city. He's been here for 3,000 years. "A dragon, huh?" Caleb smiled indulgently. Every planet had its myths and legends. "And I suppose this dragon breathes fire and hoards treasure?" The child's silver eyes narrowed. "Zarok doesn't need fire. His claws can cut through starship metal. And he doesn't care about treasure. He protects us from the void spawn and the desert beasts." Before Caleb could respond, a deafening roar echoed across the city, so powerful it rattled the cobblestones beneath his feet. The marketplace erupted in chaos as people dropped their goods and fled toward stone shelters built into the city walls. "That's not the feeding roar!" the child cried, eyes wide with terror as he ran. Caleb stood frozen, watching as something massive soared above the city walls, a creature of impossible proportions, its wingspan blocking out the sun for several heartbeats. Its scales glittered like polished obsidian, reflecting blue and purple iridescence with each powerful movement. The beast circled once, twice, then dove toward the eastern side of the city with predatory precision. Against all better judgment, Caleb ran toward it. By the time he reached the eastern quarter, the scene had descended into horror. A merchant caravan, likely having arrived just after the ceremonial procession, lay in ruins. Carts were splintered, goods scattered across the blood-stained stones. And in the center of the destruction stood the dragon. Up close, Zarok was even more terrifying, standing nearly 50 feet tall on his hind legs. His body was a perfect fusion of predatory power and otherworldly grace. Massive claws, each longer than Caleb's forearm, dripped with fresh blood as the creature tore into what remained of a transport beast. The dragon's eyes glowed with an unnatural amber light, and a ridge of crystalline spines ran from his head down to the tip of his barbed tail. The ceremonial procession Caleb had witnessed earlier now cowered behind a fallen stone column. The woman with the elaborate headdress, tiara, the child had called her, was frantically flipping through an ancient-looking tome while shouting commands to her acolytes. They responded by arranging themselves in a semicircle, raising their arms in unison as they began a haunting chant. The dragon paused in his feast, head swiveling toward them. A low growl rumbled from his throat, a sound so deep Caleb felt it in his bones. "The binding words aren't working," one of the acolytes cried. "He's breaking through the ancestral commands." Tiara's voice rose above the chaos, her words forming unfamiliar syllables that seemed to hang in the air with an electric charge. The dragon took a threatening step toward them, jaws opening to reveal rows of dagger-like teeth. Something clicked in Caleb's mind, a memory from his childhood on his family's farm. The way his father had trained their guardhounds, massive beasts that could tear a man apart but would sit obediently at a single command. Without fully processing the insanity of what he was about to do, Caleb stepped out from behind the rubble. He walked directly into the dragon's line of sight, ignoring the gasps and warnings from the Caecilians. Zarok's massive head swung toward him, nostrils flaring as he caught Caleb's unfamiliar scent. The dragon's pupils narrowed to slits, and he rose to his full height, wings half extended in a display of dominance. Caleb planted his feet shoulder-width apart, squared his shoulders, and pointed directly at the ground beside him. "Sit," he commanded, his voice clear and firm, filled with an authority he didn't entirely feel. For 3 excruciating seconds, nothing happened. The dragon stared, unmoving. Caleb could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could feel cold sweat trickling down his spine. He'd made a terrible mistake. Then, impossibly, Zarok folded his hind legs beneath him and sat on the blood-stained cobblestones with a ground-shaking thud. A collective gasp rose from the hiding Caecilians. Tiara's ancient book slipped from her fingers, thudding to the ground as she stared in open-mouthed shock. Caleb released the breath he'd been holding. He took a cautious step forward, maintaining eye contact with the massive creature. "Good boy," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Zarok's head tilted slightly, the glow in his eyes dimming to a softer amber. The dragon's tail twitched once, then curled around his massive body. A murmur spread through the gathering crowd. Caecilians were emerging from their hiding places, pointing and whispering. Caleb became acutely aware that he had just done something unprecedented, something that was reshaping their understanding of their world before his eyes. Tiara stepped forward, her ceremonial robes swishing across the cobblestones. Up close, Caleb could see that her blue skin was several shades darker than most Caecilians, marked with intricate silver patterns that weren't just paint, but seemed embedded in her skin. Her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and the color of quicksilver, studied him with a combination of awe and suspicion. "What magic is this, human?" she demanded, her voice carrying the musical lilt common to all Caecilians, but with an edge of authority that made it clear she was accustomed to being obeyed. 3,000 years of ritual and sacred texts, and you tame our guardian with a single word?" Before Caleb could answer, the crowd parted to make way for an elderly Caecilian dressed in elaborate robes of deep purple and gold. His face was a map of wrinkles, and the silver markings on his skin were so dense they almost resembled armor. "Highkeeper Valdris?" Tiara acknowledged with a slight bow. The old man barely nodded in response, his attention fixed on Caleb. "The outsider has interfered with sacred matters," he said, his voice surprisingly strong for one so ancient. This is blasphemy against the traditions of the Dragon Keepers. With respect, High Keeper, Caleb said, stepping forward. Your guardian was about to make a meal of your ceremonial procession. I'd call my interference timely. And who are you to judge our ways? Valdris demanded. The feeding frenzy is part of Xeroc's nature. The Dragon Keepers have managed these episodes for millennia, with proper rituals and spiritual guidance. Look to me like your rituals weren't working too well today, Caleb observed, nodding toward the bloody remains of the caravan. Tiara stepped between them, her posture rigid. The outsider speaks truth, High Keeper. Our binding words failed. Had he not intervened. She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Valdris's eyes narrowed. Then, we must consult the ancient texts for stronger bindings. The traditional way has served us for generations. Or, Caleb suggested, you could try a more direct approach. He turned back to Xeroc, who remained sitting exactly where Caleb had commanded, watching the proceedings with what almost seemed like curiosity. Stand, Caleb said firmly. The dragon rose to all fours, his movements fluid and controlled. A collective gasp rose from the crowd once more. Tiara's silver eyes widened, fixed on Caleb with new intensity. Impossible, Valdris whispered. Only those of the goddess-blessed bloodline should be able to command the guardian. A tall, armored Caecilian pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on the hilt of an energy sword at his hip. High Keeper, this outsider is dangerous. He undermines our sacred traditions. I recommend immediate imprisonment until we determine his true nature and intentions. Always the diplomat, aren't you, Captain Vex? Tiara said dryly. The captain ignored her, his gaze fixed on Caleb. Well, outsider, what say you to these charges? Caleb crossed his arms. I say I just saved a bunch of your people from becoming dragon snacks. You're welcome, by the way. Your interference in our sacred traditions, Vex began, is precisely why we're all still alive to have this conversation. Caleb finished for him. He turned to Tiara, sensing she might be the most reasonable of the group. Look, I'm not trying to undermine anything. Where I come from. We have a saying, if it works, don't fix it. My method worked. Maybe it's worth exploring why. Tiara studied him for a long moment, then turned to Valdris. High Keeper, the ancient texts speak of outsiders who would come in times of change. Perhaps speculation, Valdris cut her off. The prophecies are metaphorical, not literal guidelines. Then explain how he commanded Xeroc with a word, Tiara challenged. Coincidence. Luck. Perhaps Xeroc was simply confused by his foreign scent. Valdris waved a dismissive hand. Caleb smiled. Easy enough to prove it wasn't luck. He turned back to Xeroc. Down. The dragon lowered his massive body to the cobblestones, resting his head on his front claws. Roll over! To everyone's astonishment, including Caleb's, Xeroc rolled onto his back, exposing his armored belly to the sky. His wings spread out on either side, knocking over a half-collapsed market stall. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, cries of astonishment, and nervous laughter. Even Captain Vex seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Tiara stepped closer to Caleb, lowering her voice. This changes everything. The prophecy of the outsider and the chosen keeper. I had always thought it merely allegory. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Prophecy. Before she could elaborate, High Keeper Valdris raised his staff, silencing the crowd. Enough of this spectacle. Captain Vex, escort the outsider to the temple archives. Tiara, bring Xeroc back to his sanctuary. We will consult the ancient texts on this matter. And if I don't want to be escorted? Caleb asked quietly. Valdris fixed him with a stare that carried the weight of millennia. Then, you abandon these people to Xeroc's next feeding frenzy. Your methods work for now, outsider. But what happens when you leave? Will you leave us defenseless when our traditional methods have been undermined? It was a fair point, and Caleb knew it. He glanced at Zarok, still lying on his back, then at the frightened yet hopeful faces of the Cassilians. "Fine," he conceded. "Lead the way, Captain." As Vex led him toward the temple, Caleb glanced back to see Tiara approaching Zarok with cautious steps. The dragon rolled back onto his stomach, watching her with those intelligent amber eyes. For just a moment, Caleb thought he saw something pass between them, a connection deeper than handler and beast. Then, Vex nudged him forward, and the moment was lost in the shadows of the ancient temple doorway. The temple archives were unlike anything Caleb had ever seen. Vast chambers carved directly into the mountain behind the city, their walls lined with crystalline shelves that held not books, but intricate devices resembling nautilus shells. Each shell, Vex explained curtly, contained thousands of memory impressions, the collected wisdom and history of Cassila, dating back tens of thousands of years. Highkeeper Valdris led them to a central chamber where a large, circular table dominated the space. The surface of the table glowed with a soft blue light, and as Valdris placed one of the shell devices at its center, the light pulsed and expanded, projecting three-dimensional images into the air above. "The prophecy of the outsider," Valdris announced, his fingers manipulating the light to focus on specific symbols. Written during the Second Age of Harmony, nearly 7,000 years ago, the projected image settled on what appeared to be a painted scene. A figure clearly not Cassilian stood before a great dragon, one hand extended. Behind the figure stood a female Cassilian with the ceremonial headdress of a dragon keeper. "When the stars align in the pattern of awakening," Valdris read, "an outsider shall come who speaks the primal tongue, and the guardian shall bend to their will. The chosen keeper shall stand between worlds, and together they shall either bring a new age of prosperity or doom Cassila to the eternal void." "That's conveniently specific," Caleb said, studying the image. "But I don't speak any primal tongue. I just said sit." "The primal tongue isn't a language," Tiara said, entering the chamber with silent steps. "It's the language of pure intent, communication that transcends words." She had removed her ceremonial headdress, and her silver-white hair now fell in a single braid down her back. Without the formal regalia, she looked younger, perhaps no more than 25 by human standards. "Zarok responded to your intent, not your words," she continued. "For 3,000 years, we've used elaborate rituals to approximate that kind of connection. You achieved it naturally. Which is precisely why this is dangerous," Captain Vex interjected. "No training, no understanding of our traditions, yet he wields influence over our most sacred guardian." "What happened to Zarok?" Caleb asked Tiara, ignoring Vex's comment. "He's resting in his sanctuary," she replied. "Calmer than I've seen him in years." Valdris manipulated the projection again, revealing more images, historical records of dragon keepers throughout the ages, each shown performing elaborate rituals to communicate with and control dragons like Zarok. "Our traditions exist for a reason, Tiara," the Highkeeper said gravely. "The rituals, the prayers, the ceremonial bonds, they maintain balance. This outsider's methods may seem effective, but they lack the spiritual foundation that has protected Cassila for millennia." "With respect, Highkeeper," Tiara said, straightening her posture, "what if our interpretation of the traditions has become too rigid? The original Dragon Keepers didn't have elaborate rituals. The historical records show they had natural bonds with the Guardians." "Times change," Valdris replied firmly. "The natural bonds faded as our bloodlines thinned. The rituals compensate for what we have lost." Caleb watched the interplay between them with growing interest. Beneath the formal debate, he sensed a deeper conflict, one between established power and progressive thought. "What if we could restore the natural bond?" Tiara asked, her silver eyes bright with excitement. "What if this outsider Caleb could show us how. That would require testing, Valdris said dismissively. And we cannot risk Zarok becoming uncontrolled during such experiments. Then, let me try, Tiara challenged. Let me work with Caleb to see if we can establish a more direct connection with Zarok. Out of the question, Captain Vex intervened. The outsider has no standing in our society, no right to interfere with sacred traditions. Actually, Caleb said, raising a finger, according to your own prophecy, I might be exactly the person who should be interfering. He pointed to the projected image. That looks an awful lot like me, doesn't it? A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Valdris and Vex exchanged troubled glances, while Tiara's expression brightened with barely concealed hope. One test, Valdris finally conceded. Supervised by myself and the full Council of Keepers. If there is even the slightest risk to Casilla or to Zarok, it ends immediately. Agreed, Tiara said quickly, before either Caleb or Vex could object. The flight of faith, tomorrow at dawn. Valdris's ancient eyes widened. That is our most sacred ritual, performed only once a generation. Precisely why it's the perfect test, Tiara argued. If Caleb's methods truly work, they should work even in our most challenging tradition. What exactly is this flight of faith? Caleb asked, suddenly wary. Tiara turned to him, a spark of something dangerous in her silver eyes. Only the bravest and most connected keepers attempt it. Riding Zarok without harness or ritual bonds. Pure trust between keeper and guardian. And if that trust fails? Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then you fall, she said simply. From very, very high up. Caleb swallowed hard, looking between the three Cassilians. And I'm guessing no thanks isn't an option? You could leave Casilla immediately, Captain Vex suggested, not bothering to hide his preference. And leave you all to face Zarok's next feeding frenzy without my help. Caleb shook his head. I've seen what happens when those fail. Then it's settled, Tiara declared, a hint of triumph in her voice. The flight of faith, tomorrow at dawn. As Caleb was escorted to guest quarters within the temple complex, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been maneuvered into something far bigger than taming an oversized lizard. The look in Tiara's eyes, that wasn't just about proving a point to the Highkeeper. There was something personal at stake for her. And despite his better judgment, Caleb found himself intrigued to discover what it was. The guest quarters assigned to Caleb were surprisingly comfortable, a spacious room with a large window overlooking the city, furnished with items that seemed designed with non-Cassilian anatomy in mind. The bed was firmer than the cloud-like sleeping platforms he'd glimpsed in other buildings. And the chairs had backs suitable for a human spine rather than the curved Cassilian posture. We occasionally host diplomats from other worlds, Tiara explained when she arrived to check on him that evening. She had changed from her ceremonial robes into simpler attire, a fitted tunic and leggings of a material that resembled suede, but shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Though none have ever tamed our guardian with a single word. About that, Caleb said, gesturing for her to take a seat while he leaned against the windowsill. I think you're putting too much faith in my abilities. I got lucky once. Tomorrow might be a different story. Tiara studied him, her silver eyes reflecting the warm glow of the room's crystal lamps. You don't believe in the prophecy. I believe in practical solutions to immediate problems, Caleb replied. Your dragon was out of control. I used a technique that works on large predators where I come from. It's not mystical or prophetic. It's just behavioral conditioning. And yet, of all the places in all the galaxy your ship could have crashed, it brought you here, at precisely the time when our traditional methods are failing. She leaned forward, her expression intense. That doesn't strike you as significant? Caleb shrugged. The universe is full of coincidences. Some of them just happen to be useful. There are no coincidences in the pattern, Tiara said, using a term Caleb had heard several Cassilians mention. Every thread has purpose. Pattern? Our understanding of reality, she explained. Not fate, exactly, but the interconnectedness of all things. The way seemingly random events form larger designs when viewed from a higher perspective. So your people believe I was destined to crash land here and boss around your dragon? A smile touched her lips, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. When you put it that way, it does sound absurd. Completely absurd, Caleb agreed, returning her smile. And yet, here you are. Her expression grew serious again. Caleb, there's more at stake tomorrow than just proving a point to Valdris and the Council. Zarok isn't simply acting out. Something is changing in him, in all of Casila. The Void Spawn gather at our borders in greater numbers each night. The traditional methods are failing because they were never designed for what's coming. And what exactly is coming? Caleb asked, noting the worry in her eyes. Tiara rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. Legend speaks of the Great Convergence, a time when the barriers between our world and the void grow thin. The last time it happened was 3,000 years ago, when Zarok first appeared to protect Casila. So he's not native to your planet. No, the Guardians come from elsewhere. They form bonds with worlds in danger, offering protection in exchange for a home. She turned back to him. Zarok has been restless because he senses the convergence approaching. The rituals that have controlled him for centuries are becoming ineffective because they were designed for peace, not war. And you think I can help prepare him for this convergence? I think you've already begun to... She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the delicate patterns of her silver markings, like constellations mapped across her blue skin. Your approach, direct, honest, based on mutual respect rather than mystical subjugation. It's how the original Dragon Keepers worked with the Guardians before tradition and ritual obscured the true relationship. Caleb found himself studying her face, noticing details he'd missed before. The determination in her eyes, the subtle tension in her jaw that spoke of burdens carried too long alone. Why do you care so much about this? He asked softly. The High Keeper, Captain Vex, they're invested in maintaining tradition. But you seem to want change. Why? Tiara hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. Because I've seen what's coming in my dreams. The Void Spawn will overwhelm our defenses, unless Zarok is free to fight, as he was meant to. Not as a controlled weapon, but as a true guardian. Her hand moved unconsciously to a pendant at her throat, a small crystal that seemed to pulse with an inner light. And because I believe the prophecy isn't just about any keeper, it's about me. The intensity in her eyes made Caleb take a step back. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself, and on me. I know, but I've felt it my entire life, that I was meant for something beyond reciting ancient prayers and performing rituals by rote. Her voice dropped even lower. The Dragon Keepers were once spiritual leaders, warriors, visionaries. Now we're glorified jailers, using Zarok's power but never truly connecting with him. And you think I can help change that? Caleb asked, genuinely curious now, rather than skeptical. I think together, we might... She reached out hesitantly, then placed her hand on his arm. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through him. The flight of faith isn't just a test for you, Caleb. It's a chance for all of Casila to see what's possible when we move beyond our limitations. Caleb covered her hand with his own. No pressure, then. Her smile returned, brighter this time. None at all. Just try not to fall to your death. It would be terribly inconvenient for the prophecy. They shared a laugh that eased the tension, and Caleb realized he was actually looking forward to tomorrow's challenge, not just for the thrill of it, but for the chance to see Tiara's vision realized. After she left, he spent a long time at the window, watching the 3 moons of Casila rise above the horizon, casting their multicolored light across the ancient city. In the distance, he could see the massive silhouette of Zarok, perched atop the highest spire of the temple, his wings occasionally stretching out against the starlit sky. "What have I gotten myself into?" Caleb murmured. But despite the danger ahead, he felt more alive than he had in years of drifting from planet to planet. There was purpose here, not just fixing his ship and moving on, but being part of something truly significant. For the first time since his crash landing, Caleb found himself hoping the repairs might take a little longer than expected. Dawn broke over Casilla in a spectacle of amber and rose, the light refracting through the city's crystalline spires to cast rainbows across the central plaza. By the time Caleb emerged from the temple, a crowd had already gathered. It seemed the entire population had turned out to witness the flight of faith. Highkeeper Valdris awaited him at the foot of a towering platform, his ceremonial robes even more elaborate than the day before. Beside him stood Captain Vex, looking distinctly unhappy, and a semicircle of robed figures Caleb assumed were the Council of Keepers. "You look rested, outsider," Valdris observed. "I had expected more nervousness from one about to attempt our most sacred ritual." "I've crashed ships on 7 different planets and walked away each time," Caleb replied with more confidence than he felt. "Heights don't scare me much anymore." "It is not the height you should fear," Vex said darkly, "but the Guardian's temperament. Even our most experienced keepers approach the flight with humility and trepidation." "Speaking of experienced keepers," Caleb glanced around, "where's Tiara?" As if in answer to his question, a hush fell over the crowd. Caleb turned to see Tiara ascending the steps to the platform, dressed in what could only be described as ceremonial flight armor. The sleek, iridescent material clung to her form, while still allowing freedom of movement, and instead of the elaborate headdress she'd worn before, she now wore a simple circlet that kept her silver-white hair from her face. She looked powerful, determined, and absolutely stunning. "The Keeper approaches," Valdris announced loudly. "Now we summon the Guardian." The High Keeper raised an ancient horn to his lips and blew a single, resonant note that echoed across the plaza and beyond, to the mountains surrounding Casilla. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, a distant roar answered the call. Zarok appeared from behind the temple mountain, his massive wings carrying him in a wide arc above the city before he descended toward the platform. He landed with surprising grace for a creature of his size, his claws finding purchase on specially designed grooves in the stone. Up close, in the clear light of dawn, Caleb could appreciate the dragon's true majesty. Zarok's scales weren't simply black as he'd first thought, but a deep, shifting iridescence that moved between midnight blue, purple, and emerald, depending on how the light struck them. His eyes were intelligent, alert, taking in the scene with evident awareness. "Approach the Guardian," Valdris instructed Caleb. "If he accepts you, proceed with the flight. If not..." The High Keeper left the consequence unspoken. Caleb stepped forward, acutely aware of thousands of eyes upon him. He maintained eye contact with Zarok as he approached, his movements slow and deliberate. The dragon watched him, head tilting slightly, in what Caleb chose to interpret as recognition. "Hey there, big guy," Caleb said softly when he was close enough. "Remember me?" Zarok lowered his massive head until his snout was level with Caleb's chest. The dragon inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring, then exhaled a warm breath that ruffled Caleb's hair. "I'm going to touch you now," Caleb continued in the same calm tone. "Just like yesterday." He extended his hand slowly until his palm rested against the warm scales of Zarok's snout. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This level of direct contact was apparently unusual, even forbidden, in traditional interactions with the Guardian. Zarok remained perfectly still, allowing the touch, encouraged. Caleb moved his hand in a gentle stroking motion, feeling the surprising texture of the scales, smoother than they appeared, with an almost metallic quality. "Good boy," he said, loud enough for the nearest observers to hear. "We're going to go for a little flight. Nothing complicated." He glanced at Tiara, who had approached during his interaction with Zarok. Her silver eyes were wide with wonder. "This is unprecedented," she whispered. "No keeper has ever touched Zarok without the protection of ritual boundaries." "Sometimes the direct approach works best," Caleb replied. He patted Zarok's snout once more, then said clearly, "Down." The dragon immediately lowered his body, extending one wing to create a natural ramp to his back. The crowd gasped collectively. "After you," Caleb said to Tiara with a small bow. She hesitated only briefly before ascending the wing with practiced steps. Caleb followed, finding the membrane of the wing surprisingly firm under his boots. When they reached Zarok's back, Tiara guided him to a position just behind the dragon's powerful shoulders, where the scales formed a natural saddle-like depression. "Hold here," she instructed, indicating ridges along Zarok's neck. "And whatever happens, don't let go." "Wasn't planning to," Caleb assured her, settling into position. Tiara took her place behind him, her arms circling his waist. The contact sent that same, unexpected warmth through him that he'd felt when she touched his arm the night before. "Ready?" she asked, her breath warm against his ear. Before he could answer, Zarok rose to his full height. The movement was smooth, but powerful, and Caleb tightened his grip on the scale ridges. Below, the Council of Keepers had formed a circle, their voices rising in what sounded like a blessing, or perhaps a prayer for the safety of their guardian, should the outsider prove unworthy. "Now," Caleb said firmly, leaning forward to address Zarok, "fly." The dragon's massive wings extended to their full span, casting a shadow across half the plaza. With a powerful downbeat that sent dust swirling around the platform, Zarok launched into the air. The acceleration was breathtaking. Within seconds, they were soaring high above Casila, the ancient city shrinking to a miniature version of itself below. Tiara's arms tightened around Caleb's waist as Zarok banked into a wide turn, giving them a panoramic view of the landscape. Beyond the city walls stretched the Crimson Waste, a vast desert of red sand dotted with crystalline formations that caught the morning sun and reflected it in dazzling patterns. To the north rose the mountain range that sheltered Casila from the harshest weather, its peaks wrapped in clouds. And to the east, barely visible on the horizon, was a darkness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The void breach, Caleb guessed, where these spawn Tiara had mentioned originated. "This is incredible," Caleb shouted over the rush of wind. "You're doing it," Tiara called back, her voice filled with elation. "You're actually guiding him without any ritual constraints." Indeed. Zarok seemed perfectly responsive to Caleb's subtle shifts in weight and occasional verbal commands. When Caleb leaned slightly left, the dragon banked in that direction. A gentle tap on the right side of his neck brought them sweeping back toward the city. "He's never been this responsive to anyone," Tiara said, her mouth close to Caleb's ear again. "It's like he was waiting for you." They soared over Casila again, low enough to see the upturned faces of the citizens, many with arms raised in what might have been celebration or prayer. Zarok let out a roar that reverberated through his entire body. But this wasn't the threatening sound Caleb had heard during the feeding frenzy. This was something else, a declaration, perhaps even joy. "Take us higher," Caleb commanded, and Zarok obliged, powerful wing beats carrying them up into the clouds. The air grew colder, thinner, but the exhilaration of flight overcame any discomfort. They burst through a cloud bank to find themselves in a realm of pure blue sky and brilliant sunshine. Below, the clouds formed a rippling white sea, with only the highest peaks of the mountains breaking through. "I've never been this high," Tiara admitted, her voice filled with wonder. The traditional flight of faith follows a prescribed route around the city perimeter. Seems like a waste of good wings, Caleb replied, with a grin she couldn't see, but might have felt in the relaxation of his shoulders. For several minutes, they soared in companionable silence, enjoying the freedom and the spectacle of the world below. Then, Caleb felt Tiara shift behind him. "May I try?" she asked hesitantly. Caleb glanced back at her. "Try what?" "Guiding him, without rituals or ceremonial words. Just as you do." He nodded, understanding the significance of her request. "Of course." They carefully maneuvered to switch positions, a delicate dance performed hundreds of feet above the ground. When they settled again, Tiara was in front, Caleb behind her with his arms around her waist. The intimacy of the position wasn't lost on either of them, but the moment called for more focus on survival than awkwardness. "What do I do?" Tiara asked, her hands finding the ridges along Zarok's neck. "Talk to him," Caleb suggested. "Not with ritual words, just talk. Let him feel your intent." Tiara took a deep breath. "Zarok," she said, her voice clear despite the rushing wind. "Turn toward the mountains." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the dragon began to bank toward the northern peaks. "It's working!" Tiara exclaimed, her body tensing with excitement beneath Caleb's arms. "He's listening to me without the ceremonial phrases." "Try something else," Caleb encouraged. "Dive," Tiara commanded with newfound confidence. Gently, Zarok tucked his wings slightly, initiating a controlled descent that sent them spiraling toward the cloud layer below. As they broke through the white mist, Tiara laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy that Caleb found infectious. "This is how it was meant to be," she called back to him. "This connection, it's what the first dragon keepers must have experienced." They spent another hour exploring the skies around Kasila, Tiara growing more confident with each successful command. Zarok responded to her with increasing sensitivity, anticipating her intentions almost before she expressed them. The bond between them was palpable, growing stronger with each passing minute. Finally, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Tiara directed Zarok back toward the city. The dragon circled once above the central plaza, now even more crowded than before, and landed with perfect precision on the platform where their journey had begun. The moment they touched down, the crowd erupted in cheers and calls that Caleb couldn't understand, but recognized as celebratory. As they dismounted via Zarok's extended wing, Highkeeper Valdris approached, his ancient face an unreadable mask. "The flight of faith has been completed," he announced formally. "And more. You have taken our guardian beyond the traditional boundaries, yet returned safely. This requires contemplation." "It requires acknowledgement," Tiara said firmly, standing tall beside Caleb. "What we experienced confirms the prophecy. The traditional methods have their place, but we must evolve if we are to face the coming convergence." Captain Vex stepped forward, his expression less hostile than before. "I witnessed it all from the temple spire. The Guardian's responsiveness, the harmony of your flight." He hesitated, then inclined his head slightly to Caleb. "Perhaps there is wisdom in the outsider's methods." "There is wisdom in balance," Valdris corrected, "between tradition and innovation, between the old ways and the new." He fixed his gaze on Tiara. "The archives must be consulted. If the prophecy truly speaks of you and this outsider, then the ritual of bonding may be necessary." Tiara's eyes widened slightly, and a flush of deeper blue spread across her cheeks. "The ritual of bonding hasn't been performed in 1,000 years." "What's the ritual of bonding?" Caleb asked, looking between them. Before anyone could answer, a distant alarm sounded from the city walls. Captain Vex immediately straightened, his hand moving to his weapon. "Void spawn," he announced grimly. "The eastern breach has widened." "How many?" Valdris demanded. "More than we've ever encountered," came a voice from the crowd as a guard pushed his way forward. They've already overwhelmed the outer defensive line. Mobilize the crystalline guard, Vex ordered. All civilians to the inner sanctums. As the plaza erupted in controlled chaos, Caleb turned to Tiara. What exactly are these void spawn? Entities from beyond our reality, she explained quickly. They seep through breaches in the dimensional fabric, normally just a few at a time, easily managed by our defenses and Zarok's occasional patrols. But if they've overwhelmed the outer line, then we need Zarok. Caleb finished for her. He turned to the dragon, who was already alert. Head turned toward the eastern wall, where flashes of unnatural purple light could be seen even from the plaza. Will you help us? Caleb asked directly. Zarok lowered his massive head until he was eye level with Caleb. There was intelligence in those amber eyes. Not just animal awareness, but something deeper, more complex. We need to go now, Tiara said urgently. Before they reach the inner city. Caleb nodded, then turned to Valdris. You said something about a ritual being necessary? Is there time for that? The High Keeper's ancient eyes narrowed in calculation. Not the full ritual of bonding. No. But perhaps an abbreviated version, enough to strengthen your connection for the battle ahead. What does it involve? Caleb asked, aware that time was running short as more alarms joined the first. A joining of energies, physical and spiritual, Valdris replied. Follow me to the inner sanctum, quickly. As they hurried toward the temple, Caleb glanced at Tiara, whose expression was a complex mixture of determination and something else, anticipation, perhaps even nervousness. This ritual, he said quietly, as they rushed up the temple steps. What exactly does joining of energies mean? Her silver eyes met his briefly. It's a sacred union between keepers who share a guardian. In the ancient days, it was both ceremonial and intimate. Intimate, Caleb repeated, suddenly understanding her blush earlier. As in, we don't have time for the full ritual, she assured him quickly. Valdris means to perform only the spiritual linking, the laying of hands, the exchange of life essence. Life essence? Blood, breath, focused intent, she explained, as they entered the temple. The physical union would traditionally come later, after proper preparation. Right, Caleb said, trying to process this information while also preparing mentally for battle against interdimensional entities. Just another day crashed on an alien planet. The inner sanctum was a circular chamber deep within the mountain, illuminated by crystals that pulsed with an inner light. At its center was a raised dais, surrounded by intricate patterns, carved into the stone floor. Patterns that, Caleb noticed, matched the silver markings on Tiara's skin. Valdris moved with surprising speed for one, so ancient, gathering crystalline vessels and powders from alcoves around the chamber. Stand upon the dais, he instructed. Face each other. As Caleb and Tiara took their positions, the sounds of battle became audible, even through the thick mountain stone. Roars, explosions, the distinctive hum of energy weapons. We need to hurry, Tiara urged. Valdris nodded grimly. He approached with a small, ceremonial blade of crystal. Your hands, he said. Caleb and Tiara extended their right hands, with quick, precise movements. Valdris made shallow cuts across their palms, then pressed their bleeding hands together. Through blood, be bound, the High Keeper intoned. Through breath, be one. He sprinkled a fine powder over their joined hands that momentarily flared with blue fire, though Caleb felt no heat. Now, Valdris continued, breathe as one. Share the air of life between you. Tiara stepped closer, her silver eyes fixed on Caleb's. We breathe together, she explained softly, mouth to mouth. Before Caleb could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The contact was gentle at first, but as he felt her exhale into him, something extraordinary happened. A warmth spread from the point of contact, racing through his body like liquid fire. He instinctively breathed back into her, and the sensation intensified. Images flashed through his mind. Memories that weren't his. Tiara as a child, selected for keeper training. Years of study and ritual. The first time she saw Zarok, felt his presence in her mind. The growing certainty that the traditional methods were failing. Dreams of the void spawn overwhelming Casilla. And then, startlingly clear, the moment she first saw Caleb in the marketplace. The instant recognition that here, at last, was the outsider from the prophecy. The kiss, for it had become far more than a ritualistic exchange of breath, deepened as these memories flowed between them. Caleb found himself sharing his own past, his family's farm on a distant colony world, his years as a pilot, the series of misadventures that had ultimately brought him to Casilla. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. Their joined hands glowed with a soft silver light that matched the patterns on Tiara's skin. Patterns that, Caleb now realized, were beginning to appear faintly on his own hand, where it touched hers. "The bond is formed," Valdris announced, satisfaction evident in his voice despite the urgency of the moment. Incomplete, but sufficient for what lies ahead. A tremendous crash shook the temple, sending dust raining from the ancient ceiling. "They've breached the inner wall." Captain Vex's voice came from the chamber entrance. "We need the Guardian now." Outside, they found Casilla transformed into a battlefield. The beautiful blue-tinted walls of the inner city were cracked and scorched in places. Crystalline Guard soldiers formed defensive lines, their energy weapons firing in coordinated volleys at what could only be described as tears in reality. Vertical rifts of swirling darkness from which emerged distorted, writhing forms. The void spawn were unlike any creatures Caleb had encountered in his travels. They seemed only partially material, their bodies shifting between solid form and vaporous shadow. Some had multiple limbs ending in wicked claws. Others moved like serpents through the air itself. All had eyes that glowed with the same purple light as the rifts that spawned them. Zarok awaited them at the temple entrance, his massive body coiled like a spring, ready for battle. When he saw Caleb and Tiara, he lowered his head in what almost seemed like a bow. "He senses the bond," Tiara explained, her voice filled with wonder, despite the chaos around them. "He recognizes us as true keepers now." Caleb nodded, feeling a new connection not just to Tiara, but to Zarok as well. A sense of the dragon's thoughts and emotions that hadn't been present before. He could feel Zarok's eagerness to protect his home, his rage at the invaders, and something else, a recognition that this battle was different from those that had come before. More important, perhaps decisive. "Let's not keep him waiting," Caleb said, extending his hand to Tiara. They mounted Zarok with practiced ease, as if they'd been flying together for years rather than hours. As the dragon launched into the air, Caleb felt a surge of shared purpose flowing between the three of them, a unity of intent that transcended words or commands. From above, the scale of the invasion became clear. Dozens of rifts had opened along the eastern perimeter of Casilla, each spewing forth more void spawn. The creatures attacked with terrible purpose, targeting the city's defensive crystals and power nodes. "They're more organized than ever before," Tiara observed, her thoughts flowing directly into Caleb's mind through their new bond. "This isn't a random incursion. It's a coordinated attack." "Then we need to be equally coordinated," Caleb replied, both aloud and mentally. He directed his thoughts to Zarok as well. "The rifts, can we close them?" The dragon's response came not in words, but in images and impressions. Concentrated fire at the edges of each rift could destabilize it, causing it to collapse in on itself. But the void spawn would defend their entry points fiercely. "We need to divide their forces," Tiara suggested. "Draw them away from the rifts so the crystalline guard can target the breaches directly." Caleb nodded. "Zarok, can you get their attention?" The dragon needed no further encouragement. He circled higher, then released a roar that shook the very air around them, a challenge impossible to ignore. Immediately, many of the void spawn turned their attention upward, their glowing eyes fixing on the Guardian with evident hatred. "Here they come," Caleb warned, as dozens of the flying spawn broke away from the ground assault and rose to meet them. What followed was the most extraordinary aerial battle of Caleb's life. Zarok moved with incredible speed and precision, his massive claws tearing through void spawn while his armored scales deflected their attacks. Caleb and Tiara worked in perfect harmony, their joined consciousness allowing them to anticipate each other's thoughts and coordinate with Zarok's movements. When a particularly large spawn latched onto Zarok's left wing, Caleb instinctively reached out, channeling energy through the silver patterns, now clearly visible on his skin. To his astonishment, a bolt of blue-white force erupted from his hand, striking the creature and dissolving it into mist. "The Keeper's gift!" Tiara exclaimed, her excitement flooding their bond. "The ritual worked!" She demonstrated her own command of this energy, sending arcs of power into clusters of approaching spawn. Each bolt found its mark with unerring accuracy, guided by their shared consciousness and amplified by Zarok's ancient power. Below, the crystalline guard had recognized their strategy and was regrouping, focusing their firepower on the rifts, while Zarok and the Keepers kept the spawn occupied above. One by one, the smaller rifts began to collapse, snapping shut with flashes of energy that briefly illuminated the battlefield. But the largest rift, a towering tear in reality near the eastern gate, remained stubbornly open, spawning larger and more dangerous entities with each passing minute. "We need to close that one directly," Tiara communicated through their bond. "Nothing else will stop this invasion." Caleb understood her meaning immediately. "Straight into the heart of it?" "Together," she confirmed, her hand finding his where they both gripped Zarok's scales. Caleb conveyed their intention to Zarok, who responded with grim determination. The dragon banked sharply, then dove toward the main rift, gathering speed as they descended. Void spawn swarmed to intercept them, but Zarok's claws and the Keeper's energy bolts cleared a path through their ranks. As they approached the rift, Caleb could feel its wrongness, a fundamental violation of natural law that made his very atoms recoil. Within its swirling darkness, he glimpsed another reality, a realm of perpetual shadow where writhing forms waited to cross over. "On my mark," Tiara instructed, raising her free hand toward the rift. Caleb mirrored her action, feeling energy building between them, channeling through Zarok and amplifying. "Now!" They released their combined power directly into the center of the rift. The energy struck the tear and seemed to momentarily stabilize it. But then, instead of closing, the rift began to expand. "It's not working!" Caleb shouted, both aloud and mentally. Tiara's determination flooded their bond. "We need more power. We need to complete the ritual." "Here, now," Caleb asked incredulously, as Zarok wheeled away from a surge of void spawn, barely avoiding their claws. "Not the physical union," Tiara clarified quickly, "but the spiritual one. We need to fully merge our consciousnesses, not just share thoughts, but become a single mind with Zarok." "How?" "Focus on me," she instructed, turning in their makeshift saddle to face him. "See nothing else. Feel nothing else." Despite the chaos around them, Caleb locked eyes with Tiara. Her silver gaze captured his, and the world seemed to slow around them. He was distantly aware of Zarok circling the rift, keeping the void spawn at bay through sheer force of will. But his entire consciousness was focused on Tiara. She pressed her forehead to his, and the connection between them exploded into something far beyond their previous bond. There was no longer Caleb and Tiara. There was only a single consciousness existing in two bodies, and then three, as Zarok joined the union. Through this perfect unity, Caleb, Tiara, Zarok understood what needed to be done. The void spawn weren't truly evil. They were lost, drawn to the light and life of Casila like moths to flame. Their aggression stemmed from fear and disorientation. The rifts weren't invasions, but cries for help from a dying reality. With this understanding came power, not the destructive force they had been wielding, but something creative, healing. As Zarok made a final pass directly through the rift, the unified consciousness released this power, not as a weapon, but as a gift. Light erupted from their joined hands, not the blue-white energy of before, but a warm, golden radiance that filled the rift from edge to edge. Where it touched void spawn, they transformed, their twisted forms straightening, their glowing purple eyes shifting to gold. The rift itself began to change, its tearing edges smoothing, its chaotic center stabilizing. When the light faded, the rift remained but transformed. What had been a jagged wound in reality was now a stable portal, its edges crystallized and controllable. The void spawn had become something else entirely, still otherworldly, but no longer monstrous. Their forms more defined, more harmonious with Casila's reality. As their consciousnesses gradually separated, Caleb, Tiara, and Zarok descended to the plaza where Highkeeper Valdris and Captain Vex awaited, with expressions of utter astonishment. "What have you done?" Valdris asked, his ancient voice trembling with emotion. Tiara dismounted first, her legs unsteady after the intensity of their merged experience. "We didn't destroy the rift, we healed it, and the void spawned with it." "Impossible," Captain Vex breathed, watching as one of the transformed creatures drifted peacefully overhead, its golden eyes regarding the Casilians with curiosity rather than malice. The prophecy didn't speak of destruction, Caleb realized aloud, the full meaning becoming clear to him now. When it mentioned prosperity or doom, it wasn't predicting two possible outcomes. It was offering a choice. "We chose prosperity. For both worlds," Tiara added, her hand finding Caleb's. The silver patterns on their skin glowed softly where they touched, a permanent reminder of their bond. The void was dying. That's why the spawn were coming through in greater numbers. They weren't invading. They were fleeing. Zarok rumbled his agreement, his massive head lowering to nudge Caleb's shoulder affectionately. Highkeeper Valdris studied the transformed rift for a long moment, then turned back to them with newfound respect in his ancient eyes. "It seems we have much to learn about the true nature of the pattern. The old ways served their purpose, but perhaps it is indeed time for new guardians, new methods." He bowed deeply to both of them. "Casila owes you a debt that can never be repaid." In the days that followed, Casila began to transform as profoundly as the rift had. The stabilized portal became a source of energy that powered the entire city, eliminating the need for the crystalline power nodes that had been depleted over centuries. The transformed void spawn, now called the Luminous by the Casilians, established a peaceful presence along the city's perimeter, serving as intermediaries between the two realities. Trade routes that had been abandoned due to void spawn attacks were reopened. Diplomatic missions from other systems, hearing of the miracle at Casila, arrived to establish relations. The city that had been isolated for generations suddenly found itself at the center of a new network of interstellar cooperation. Caleb's ship remained unrepaired, by choice, now, rather than necessity. As an honorary dragon keeper and hero of Casila, he found himself with new purpose, new connections that were far more meaningful than his previous wandering existence. 3 months after the Battle of the Rift, as it came to be known, Caleb and Tiara stood on the balcony of the newly renamed Temple of Harmony, watching the sunset paint the transformed city in hues of gold and rose. The silver patterns they shared had spread further across their skin, an external manifestation of a bond that deepened with each passing day. "The Interstellar Harmony Center's construction begins tomorrow," Tiara said, leaning against his shoulder. Representatives from 7 systems will attend the foundation ceremony. And the completed ritual? Caleb asked, his arms slipping around her waist. A smile touched her lips. Tonight, if you're not too busy saving worlds. I think I can clear my schedule, he replied, drawing her closer. Below them, new structures rose throughout Casila, buildings that blended traditional Casilian architecture with innovations from a dozen worlds. Citizens mingled with visitors from across the galaxy, their voices creating a harmonious backdrop to the evening. Zarok soared overhead, no longer bound by ritual or duty, but choosing to remain as guardian out of love for his keepers and their city. 2 Luminous accompanied him, their golden light trailing like comets against the darkening sky. As Tiara turned in Caleb's arms to kiss him, a kiss that sent silver light cascading across their skin, a distant signal pinged on the communicator he still wore from his pilot days. He ignored it at first, lost in the moment, but Tiara eventually pulled back with a knowing smile. "You heard that," she said. "It wasn't a question." Caleb nodded. "Distress call. Long range? Probably nothing." "Probably another prophecy fulfilling itself," she corrected him, her silver eyes sparkling with the promise of adventure. "Another world that needs what we can offer." "We just fixed this one," Caleb protested, though without much conviction. "And now it runs perfectly well without our constant supervision." She nodded toward Zarok, who had landed on a nearby spire and was watching them with intelligent amber eyes. "Besides, I think our guardian is getting restless." Caleb laughed, realizing she was right. The 3 of them, human, Casilian, and dragon, had found their purpose not in settling down but in bringing harmony where there was conflict, understanding where there was fear. "Where do you think the signal's coming from?" Tiara asked, as they turned to watch the final rays of sunlight disappear behind the western mountains. "Does it matter?" Caleb replied, pulling her close again. "Wherever it is, we'll face it together." Above them, the first stars of evening appeared, countless worlds waiting to be discovered, or perhaps saved. But that was tomorrow's adventure. Tonight belonged to them, to the bond they shared, and to the city they had transformed through the simple power of understanding, trust, and love. As darkness fell over Casila, the silver patterns on their skin glowed like constellations, mapping not just their connection to each other, but to all the possibilities that stretched before them. An infinity of worlds where an outsider, a keeper, and their guardian might bring light to the darkness, one impossible miracle at a time.